Hello everyone. Good afternoon or good morning depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to the ALCTS webinar, Don't Tilt at Windmills, an active learning approach to teaching FRBR. My name is Jordan Fields and I'm a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. Our presenters today are James P. Asher, Assistant Professor and Rare Book Cataloger at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and Peter J. Ralla, Assistant Professor and Catalog Librarian at University of Colorado at Boulder Libraries. Today's presentation describes active training methods for FRBR that will assist cataloging managers to help empower their staff with new tools, anticipate challenges in implementation, and build team morale. If you have questions for our presenters, please type them into the question box on your screen, and James or Peter will answer them at the conclusion of their presentation. Also, please note today's session will be recorded, and you will receive an email with a link to the recording shortly after the conclusion of the webinar. A copy of the slides will also be provided. There may be a slight delay as I turn the presentation over to James and we can get started.
All right, so I think we should have the opening slide up. So thank you to Jordan for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for coming to this. It's a real pleasure to have this opportunity to talk to you and to share some of the work Peter and I have been playing with at the University of Colorado at Boulder. I think you'll really enjoy this, and it should be kind of a change of pace from the sort of presentation you see, because we're not going to actually talk about FRBR per se. We're going to talk about how to teach FRBR, and how this might relate to various training issues within your library. Though I'd argue the best way to learn something is actually to teach it. And as you're going to hear, going through these exercises with your department will not only help you but everyone else learn the standard together, but it will also teach you something about how your department works. Now, if this seminar leaves you hungry for more on FRBR and more on RDA, you might actually tune into Robert L. Maxwell's, who's a truly fantastic cataloger at Brigham Young University. He'll be presenting on this topic as part of the same ALCTS webinar series on December 15th. So without further ado, let's get into what we're talking about. Why teach FRBR? Really, I mean, isn't FRBR just some academic model? A number of things loom large, namely the widespread adoption of RDA, which, if you look closely at the structure, it's kind of based on works, expressions, manifestations, and items, persons, families, corporate bodies, and concepts, objects, events, and places. This structure should probably seem a little bit familiar. In fact, it is FRBR. As RDA seems to be a near inevitable change that is coming to cataloging departments soon, really independent of its usefulness or validity, will soon be faced with this new model or monstrosity that will lead to the next response. Ultimately, change is coming. In our heart of hearts, we all know that a new vision is needed in our increasingly digital environment in which special collections play the role of print materials. Yet, why is RDA met with such consternation and fear? I argue that this fear comes from a general sense of unawareness. While many great articles exist about new cataloging standards, many smack of false charity. The chief elder cataloger will reduce the standard to a simple procedure that even the uninitiated can understand. Procedures will be written, which make the standards easy to read, and workshops will be held to teach the basics. However, these tasks fall short of empowering transformation and rely on the sort of banking model of education. Paulo Freire, in a slightly different context, says that true generosity consists precisely in fighting to destroy the causes which nourish false charity. False charity constrains the fearful and the subdued, the rejects of life, to extend their trembling hands. True generosity lies in striving so that these hands, whether individual or entire peoples, need be extended less and less in supplication, so that more and more they become the human hands which work and in working transform the world. The simplifications and paraphrases of cataloging standards underscore this sort of dehumanizing argument that intelligent employees cannot read the document itself and thus are not part of the dialogue. Thus, I argue we are fearful of the change. Of course, not everyone has time or can read everything. But a good example is AACR2, which of course not everyone reads or has read. The acceptance comes from a mix of availability. Just about any cataloger can get a copy, and also through socialization. Enough catalogers have and do read it that those who are too busy can trust the hermeneutic analysis of someone they know and respect who has read AACR2. This is really a problem with all of our new cataloging systems. How many people, for example, have read all of FRBR? Did you know that there's an entire chapter in FRBR translating the terminology into terms that are comprehensible to our public service colleagues? How many of your copy catalogers colleagues have read it? How empowered do you think your colleagues feel to adopt RDA if they haven't fully read FRBR, a standard that came out, I may remind you, in 1998, on which the entire structure is based? So musing on these questions, Peter and I and a group of others decided we'd run a co-instructional dialogical series on reading FRBR to create the social awareness of the text. Not present a simplification, but reading the entire document of FRBR and discussing it as a department. Of course, we knew not everyone would read it, but as long as sufficient people did read it, we'd begin to have this socialized understanding. Really, our process at the highest level consisted of 3 discrete steps. Generate buzz. We had to find a location, develop discrete and exciting events, and encourage the department to read the standard at their level and discuss it without fear of being incorrect. We had to develop an essentially convivial space for discussion. Provide a reason to know. The power of socialization is great, and by creating a team-oriented simulation that uses the contents of FRBR, the document, which of course hopefully some of the people had just read, there's really a reason to start understanding and start thinking about it. Working in groups is significant here because some of the people will never read the document nor understand it, but the collaboration allows the natural leaders to begin to emerge. Debrief and document. Perhaps what I think is one of the more important steps. Discuss the challenges, explore the strengths and weaknesses while reaching towards a common understanding. An experience can be difficult to contextualize and incorporate into one's worldview. So debriefing allows everyone to share their voice about how to read the standard, and it implementizes the challenges with both new cataloging tools and in implementing FRBR, and of course by extension RDA, which is based on FRBR.
So this is Peter now, and I'm picking up where James left off. James has been talking about the reasons we decided to put on the FRBR training for our cataloging staff, and also the theoretical base upon which we built it. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about what we actually did and give some greater detail on the actual steps we went through. And again, this was all based on the outline that James just mentioned of the 3 steps: generating buzz, providing a reason, and then debriefing and documenting what we learned and what we discussed. And we have here our emblematic image of Don Quixote tilting at the windmill, and I'll let you all figure out, parse that metaphor as you wish. So as James said, the first step that we needed to do was to generate buzz about the project, to get people excited and involved, and more importantly, to get them to actually sit down and read the text of FRBR. Like James said, we didn't want to summarize it for people. We wanted to have people actually working with what the standard itself says. We decided to hold our training sessions during the monthly meetings of the monographic cataloging team, which all catalogers on campus are invited to. We uploaded the entire text of FRBR to a website for the staff and faculty of the libraries to read using a blog platform. We made the blog public a few weeks before the meeting was to be held, and then a week or so before opening up the blog for people to read, we began the process of generating buzz by sending out a couple of email announcements. These emails announced the upcoming training sessions and promised, without giving too many details, a fun and creative way to attack FRBR, and with the hook of using a lot of strings of colored yarn. About a week later, we opened up the blog, and this is an image of what it looked like. There are, of course, many Web 2.0 tools that we could have used, such as SharePoint, which our library already uses, or a wiki, but we decided that a blog format would work best. What we wanted was to make sure we wanted to make the entire text of FRBR available, and have people comment on it, but we didn't want anyone to change the actual text. We wanted it to stay as it is, but have comments next to it and legible to everyone. So to accomplish this, what we decided on was a WordPress platform for the blog, where we pasted in the text of FRBR a small chapter or section at a time. And then to allow comments, as you can see here on the right, we used a plugin called digress.it, which permits readers to comment in the margins of every paragraph. To encourage participation, we didn't open up the whole text all at once, but instead we made a section or two public every couple of days throughout the weeks leading up to the meeting that was going to have the training session. We didn't get everyone in the department to participate and comment, but we did have a core group of about 5 or 6 people who regularly made comments, and we also knew from casual conversations within the department that more people were reading the text but not commenting. We nurtured the discussion by recognizing and rewarding participation in it. For example, when each new section of the text was made public on the blog, we sent out an email to all the catalogers on campus to announce the next section, and in these emails we called out by name those who had made comments on the previous section. For example, great comments this time by Wendy, Gina, and Christina, and then announcing that the new section is open. To further encourage participation, James took on the role of rainmaker and trickster and seeded the metaphoric cloud for comments. For example, he occasionally added his own leading questions, or he would make a comment that contained obvious untruths or misreadings of the text. And being catalogers, we couldn't let a faulty interpretation of a rule go unnoticed, and a livelier discussion would ensue. The readings in FRBR and the comments on the blog site led up to the group activities, which then took place over 2 successive monthly meetings of the monographic cataloging team. In the first meeting, we looked at Group 1 entities: work, expression, manifestation, and item. As I said, we made a few announcements ahead of time to hype the activity before it happened, and this hyping allowed us also to plug the blog and the readings. This was the second step of the process: give people a reason to read FRBR. We told people that they needed to read the text in order to take part in the activity. The activity, though, was actually something of a Trojan horse. We promised a fun and unusual group activity as a way to get people to read and comment on the text of FRBR. Also, even within the activity itself, the answers to the problems were not really the point. The point was to get people working together and talking about FRBR. Connecting the strings correctly was not the goal. The goal was to engage with the ideas within FRBR. So how the activity actually worked. Before the activity, we, mostly meaning James, gathered up as many items in the library that we could find with Don Quixote in the title, in as many languages and formats as we could find. We also provided 4 piles of paper, each in a different color and with the name of a different entity on it. And here is light green for work. In the activity itself, groups of 3 to 5 people picked several items, and these were books, record albums, DVDs, etc., and they worked on connecting the papers and items together with the different colored pieces of yarn. The groups worked to create networks of yarn and paper depicting FRBR Group 1 relationships, and you have here an example of one of these networks. The networks we created were quite primitive compared to some of the sophisticated FRBR networks that have been created digitally using extensive bibliographic histories of books. But the hands-on approach gave the participants a better understanding of how these relationships might work in a real-world cataloging context. The second month, we held a follow-up session and concentrated on work-to-work relationships, and this time instead of Don Quixote, we used Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And we also had several new colors of yarn. Purple was for work-to-work relationships, brown was for whole-part work-to-work relationships, and then we also had orange yarn for Group 2 relationships, which are relationships to a person or corporate body, and yellow for Group 3, which are subject relationships.
Now, it's worth noting, once I get the slide to advance, there we go. It's worth noting again that our goal in all of these exercises was for the participants to connect to a singular work. In one case, Don Quixote, in another case, A Christmas Story. Using the various legal connections in FRBR, We wanted them to build kind of this room-sized web of relationships. This kind of rich experience and a collaborative experience helped to generate a buzz, as did the innovative technical platform of digress.it. The group experienced a reason to know. Everyone really wanted to have fun with colored strings. Heck, I did. It was fun putting the little labels on. And we all knew that our peers would have read some of FRBR and be working in groups with us to complete the simulation. And so there's some element of competitiveness or making sure you got your understanding straight. And ultimately, we debriefed the whole experience so that the lessons learned could be extended to other work in the libraries. You know, one of the keys to this whole project is working with the various solutions the group come up with and trying to get them to actually read the document to correct their mistakes. We're going to show you a few brief examples of the sorts of questions and mistakes people made and how to discuss them constructively. And we're actually going to ask you to answer them. But don't feel bad if you don't know the answer. You should just guess randomly, because we didn't ask you to read FRBR before you came in to do this, and you'll likely see the same sorts of answers. And hopefully Peter and I will show you the technique to how you can kind of develop an active learning environment through how you answer questions. So let's start with this. What is this? Well, it's a book, right? This is Don Quixote, Mexico, 1953. So let's start with our very first question, which is, what is the relationship between Don Quixote and this book? Think about it. So you have a couple options. Is the poll showing? Yeah, great. Okay. It could be is realized through, is embodied in, is exemplified by, or none of the above. Pick one that you think fits. Oh, this is great. We have a whole variety of answers. So you guys are seeing the poll answers as they come in? Peter, can you confirm?
Yes, I can see it. I'm not sure if the attendees can see it.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the various answers. So we have a variety chosen here, actually. People chose a lot of different things. And, oh, here we go. It's the share button. Got it. There we go, sharing the poll results. So we see answers all over the place. Let's talk about these for a second. So, you know, imagine that you've been given the challenge, connect this physical book to Don Quixote somehow, and you're playing with strings and you're trying to figure out which fits. Well, is realized through. That's not really a terribly bad choice. If you look at this in FRBR, it relates works to expressions. Don Quixote's a work, so you know it actually connects well to that, but the book isn't an expression, it's an item, right? It's a physical little thing. Is embodied in? Well, that relationship is between expressions and manifestations. Don Quixote at this level is the work, and the book is the item. So this one's actually a hard connection to make. Is exemplified is another not a bad choice, since it relates manifestations to items. The book's an item. But Don Quixote's not quite a manifestation. In fact, the answer on this one was none of the above. It was kind of a trick question, because what it brings us to is that really what you've got is a chain of relationships. And this happened early on in the training several times. You don't get to connect the actual physical book right away to the work. You actually have to use pieces of paper to say, okay, here's the expression, here's the manifestation, and here are all the various relationships between them. It's an excellent way to just start to get people thinking in terms of layers. The key to understanding this, and really we came back to this a lot when working with people, is to read from FRBR. So, you know, if someone looked at this and they were having trouble making this connection, you could read section 3.1.1. A work may be realized through one or more than one expression. An expression, on the other hand, is the realization of one and only one work. An expression may be embodied in one or more than one manifestation, and likewise, a manifestation may embody one or more than one expression. A manifestation, in turn, may be exemplified by one or more than one item, but an item may exemplify one and only one manifestation. And this highlights the chain. And so in an actual training learning environment, this is what you do. You say, wow, that's a great connection. That makes sense for this reason, but let's look at the content. Let's make this an active process.
Okay, so now for the second question, we have here Don Quixote translated from the Spanish, published by A&L Burt Company. So James kind of gave you a trick question on the first one, where he wanted you to connect the actual physical book to the work Don Quixote. I'm going to give you a little bit of a hint here. I'm not talking so much in this question 2 about the physical book, but sort of the abstract, this particular English translation of Don Quixote. And James, if you will put the poll up. And so here are the 5 questions. If you could please answer which one you think is best.
All right, we've got about 65% of the people in. If you're hesitating, just pick one. Because again, there's no wrong answer in this. You're not being graded. We're using this as an example to talk about how this stuff might work.
Yes, and I realized that there's actually a typo here, and one of these answers we actually have incorrectly, and I apologize for that. So number 4, it says a translation of, and that was supposed to say a transformation of. So that made answering this question even more difficult than it needed to be.
All right, I'm going to close it and share the results.
Okay. So that 4th one was supposed to say a transformation of, and I do again apologize for that. So those of you who answered a translation of were actually very, very correct. What we meant with the transformation is actually a FRBR terminology, a term in FRBR that means something a little more than just a translation. The 3rd answer, uniform title, that was a bit of a trick, throwing in some AACR2 terminology to confuse the matter. An expression is embodied in a manifestation. That's a good answer, and then also looks like about equally the first one, a work is realized through an expression, which what we were kind of going for here is, again, what FRBR says about translations. Excuse me. And I'm going to read what FRBR says. This is in FRBR 3.2.2. Changes in the intellectual conventions or instruments that are employed to express a work, for example, a translation from one language to another, result in the production of a new expression. If a text is revised or modified, the resulting expression is considered to be a new expression, etc. So that's kind of what we were going for here, is that a translation is a new expression. And in this slide here, we're building on our network of FRBR relationships, and you can see in the upper left corner we have the work. We have 2 expressions coming off of it, one the Spanish text, one the English translation, which are then manifested and then down to the item. So now we will go on to the next question, which is, what is the relationship from the work Don Quixote to this film, Man of La Mancha, which is based on the musical? And I think James has the poll open.
I think it's open.
Yes.
And it's worth noting, I mean, you know, we're all just kind of playing here, and this is very cheerful. But this is how the actual seminar should feel. People should feel free to guess and experiment and try different ideas. And we should all feel comfortable kind of discussing the ideas and going, well, that's really cool, but let's look at FRBR together. Let's read the section here together to try to understand what's really going on with the document. Because then again, you're empowering people. You're helping people to realize that they can read the standard. And they don't need to be afraid of these changes, because if the standards change again, they can read that too. So we're at 70%. Everyone jump in with a quick answer. And close the poll. Share it.
Okay, so it looks like most people chose the second answer is a transformation of. A few people thought this might be an expression of. So that's, and then a few people chose the latter two. For those of you who know the work, is a subject of is kind of an interesting potential answer, because Cervantes is actually a character in the story Man of La Mancha, and it dramatizes the writing of the novel. So then it looks like the real question is whether this is an expression of the work Don Quixote or a transformation of it. So going to the text of FRBR, and in this case we want to look at 5.3.1, and what it says in there is, also in the autonomous category are groupings of 4 additional relationship types: summarization, adaptation, transformation, and imitation. The kinds of works represented in these groupings all involve the modification of an original work that is sufficient in degree to warrant their being considered as new works, rather than simply different expressions of the same work. Any work falling into one of these 4 groupings is by definition considered autonomous. So that's what, and again, this is where interpretation and things like cataloger's judgment come into. It looks like most of us thought that this was a different enough work that it's autonomous and a transformation, not just an expression of the work Don Quixote. But again, there is some room to discuss that, because other people did think this was an expression. On the subject of these autonomous works, transformations, adaptations, etc., one thing that is important to highlight in FRBR is that these are relationships at the work level. So if we all agree, or if, as most of us agree, that Man of La Mancha is a transformation, it is actually a new work. And so this vertical line right here on the slide is a work-to-work relationship.
Fabulous. Well, and so, you know, I think you guys are starting to get the feel of this. More important than any individual in a department reading FRBR correctly is that the department has some sense of who really understands which components and how we can talk about this and how we develop a shared language. So let's do another example. Here we have everyone's favorite reference source, Wikipedia. Now, you know, not saying anything about the content or whatnot, but this Wikipedia article, what is the relationship from the Wikipedia article to the work Don Quixote? And let me throw up the poll. I have a couple options. We've got an adaptation of, a summarization of, has subject, or none of the above. And I'm not trying to trick you this time, just as a to be nice about it. All right, and I guess it's worth mentioning, you know, although there's a picture of a bronze statue on the article, this article is actually about the story, if you can't read it on the projector screen where you're looking at. All right, we got a little bit over 70% voting, so I'm going to close it. Jump in, jump in, jump in if you want to, and let's close it and share it. All right. So actually, this is another great example. These are all really interesting choices. What's cool about these, aside from none of the above, which is not a relationship, they're all work-to-work relationships. Well, and actually subject, which is a little bit more flexible. But the key here is to note that often, you know, people learning this, and your departments, if they're learning this, will have more trouble going beyond group 1 relationships, which may be very familiar. You know, the work, the manifestation, the expression, the item. We hear about this all the time. But we also have group 2 and group 3 relationships, not to mention work to work and others. You know, when people have a hammer, every problem looks something like a nail, and we might get odd suggestions. For something as simple as the answer here, which is actually has a subject, which is just a group 3 relationship, right? Because the subject of the Wikipedia article is Don Quixote. And this actually nicely brings up some discussions as to where the boundaries of manifestation and expressions for web pages can be located. Because when you have a question like this, I think the way we asked about the Wikipedia articles, I just printed it out and I wrote it on pen like this means the article online. The group had to discuss how to build the chain. Where did they put the manifestation? Where did they put the expression? They went back to the standard, they read it, and they discussed it. And as a group, we all learned a bit more. The key reading in FRBR that explains this is the following, 5.2.3. The entities in all 3 groups are connected to the work entity by a subject relationship. The has a subject relationship indicates that any of the entities in the model, including the work itself, may be the subject of a work. Stated in slightly different terms, the relationship indicates that a work may be about a concept, an object, an event, or place. It may be about a person or corporate body, or it may be about an expression, a manifestation, an item, or it may be about a work, which is this very case, and kind of highlights that question. So, you know, this one wasn't a trick, but it certainly brings out more things to discuss. So let's come to this. This was actually the hardest one for most people, and the question I want to ask about this is, what is the relationship from this collection to the work of Don Quixote? Note that this is actually Cervantes' complete works, including Don Quixote, but also other parts. Of course, everyone listening knows intuitively the answer, but how do we fit it into FRBR? There's a clue in the answers given. Notice they're all the same, has part, aside from none of the above, and they're at different levels. This is really a question about levels. All right, we're getting close to a little over 50%. Jump in, grab a answer. Doesn't matter, as you see, no grades. I don't actually know who answers what, so. All right, I'm going to close it in 3, 2, 1, closed. All right, so here are the results. Now this one's kind of cool. This is actually one of my favorite challenges because there's a trick to the whole part relationship in FRBR that this brings out really nicely, is that every one of the relationships is on the same level. So this is, you know, what you can show your catalogers. You can show them FRBR and say, look, these are, you know, has part is either work level, expression level, manifestation level, or item level, in that it connects either an item to item, a manifestation to manifestation, an expression to an expression, or a work to work. So in this case, what we're talking about, Don Quixote, is a work. So that's the clue. You know, so we're interested in Don Quixote's work. We want to connect to. We're interested in what it's connected to, and so we have kind of the work-to-work relationship. So the way to look at this is has part at the work level, but the others are really interesting too, because you have this expression level, this manifestation level, and item level. You know, as a guy who works with rare books, I particularly like the item level, which implies that, you know, there are multiple items contained in one item, which I come across frequently. But, you know, for this case, we're talking work level. And so one of the interesting implications about this that people sometimes have trouble with is that it implies that these complete works as a unit are in fact itself a work. And this is really difficult for some librarians to accept, since we're often used to a more Platonic sense of the work rather than, you know, an assemblage of things. So here's a little chart. Another place, this comes up with, so you can see the work-to-work relationship here, is with introductions. While technically an introduction to, say, Don Quixote and Don Quixote are both two separate works, and the two together in one volume is yet a third work using these kind of whole part relationships, we wouldn't really want to catalog this with 3 separate records. That'd be kind of crazy and ridiculous. This is really a key to understanding how FRBR is different from this kind of purely academic standard. Let me quote from 5.3.1.1. There often will be no reason for a dependent part of a work to be separately identified or described in a bibliographic record. In certain instances, however, such as when the preface or introduction has been written by a well-known author who is not the author of the main text, it may be considered useful to identify and describe the component in its own right. Because dependent parts by definition need to be placed in the context of the larger work, the relationship, if formally articulated, is typically done by appending an added entry. You guys hear that? Added entry for the component to the record describing the larger work. Alternatively, the relationship can be reflected less formally through a contents note. So what this brings out is that FRBR distinguishes these dependent from independent parts of the work, and generally dependent parts don't warrant a separate treatment so that our cataloging is not insane. Although if we want to, we could. We could create a separate work, thing for the introduction, but generally it's not what we're interested in. Normally, we're just going to do an access point. And this really sheds a light and starts to shed a light on how we might start implementing FRBR. We aren't necessarily going to create this new work record for everything, independent from the expression manifestation item, every time we catalog a book. We may just have one surrogate record for the whole chain of relationships in the case where there isn't interesting linkages. So to bring things to a close, since we tire from tilting to giants, Peter and I will emphasize a few crucial steps.
So what we learned from this activity. We learned several things, and this big word here, curate, is one of the important things we learned, that we needed to curate and manage the group activity a little more actively than we did the first time. In the first exercise with Don Quixote and the group 1 relationships, we had the small groups of catalogers pick their own items to work with. And what happened is that their experiences varied too greatly from one group to another. One group did 3 translations of Don Quixote, which was relatively straightforward, and then another group got bogged down trying to figure out what to do with an opera based on the novel. For the second activity, which was Christmas Carol and the group 2 and 3 relationships, we picked 3 or 4 items for each small group and made sure that each set of items had more or less the same variety of different types of items, an adaptation, a compilation, a musicalization, etc. The other thing we learned is that it is important to form the groups carefully and to make sure that at least one person in each group is comfortable with FRBR. And with Don Quixote, it was also nice to have at least one person in each group comfortable with the Spanish language. One thing we learned from this is how it gave us a concrete demonstration of how different people's work styles can affect how work gets done in a department. For example, in the group that included the manager of our cataloging department, that group got through all 5 of the works that we assigned to them. Another group, however, only succeeded in finishing about 1.5 books because they got tied down in a philosophical discussion about whether or not a compilation of pre-existing works should count as a new work or not. And as we've just seen, in FRBR it actually does. Anyway, this particular group's difficulties, however, were helpful, even though they didn't complete as many books as other groups did, because it did allow us to have a larger discussion about these issues. Again, the point of the whole exercise was not to give people grades for finding a correct answer or not. It was to get them engaged with FRBR. So on that level, it was a success. The last step of the activity, and again one that was more important to us than the actual connecting of strings, was to debrief and to write up on our whiteboard what we learned, what we liked and didn't like about FRBR, and any other concerns or issues that we noticed. By distilling the experience, we hope to have people take away a few concrete points and ideas with them, and we also wanted them to take away a greater comfort with and a greater knowledge of FRBR.
So, you know, Peter and I brought out the things. I think debriefing is absolutely one of our crucial steps. This step of debriefing is really crucial in broadening the experience to the actual workflow, but also remember we're aiming for kind of co-instructional goals. This exercise, in addition to teaching and empowering catalogers, is intended to help managers and team leaders to learn about how their staff apprehends the new system. Ultimately, we all have to develop a collective socialized understanding of new cataloging tools to use them. And so the debriefing and discussion is really the opportunity for the staff to focus on teaching the managers. We, for example, discovered some areas of concern that Peter already mentioned with the application of the work concept, but also some really good questions about how workflow would ultimately function. How would we determine the relationship between works for which we didn't have language expertise? Would we be able to create a way with RDA to temporarily catalog something, say in Church Slavonic, until we could find someone to help us figure out what the work was? How much work could copy catalogers be expected to do, and how much would be the responsibility of original catalogers? What about special collections and archives materials? What if our experts are not the ones working on the stuff? Many of these questions, of course, are already foremost in the mind of department managers, but considering this seminar as a simulation gives the group a focused time to explore their relationships to each other and reflect on how implementing a new system might work. In fact, a holistic view of the evolving network of relationships brings up interesting questions itself. How could this system be implemented? You know, here we have a slide showing, you know, not the yarn, but colored lines between all the works we talked, or all the items we talked about today. What does this tell us about exploring RDA, or whatever standard we use if it's based on FRBR? We can hark back to this kind of holistic view and use it as a model for articulating information architecture problems. Of course, these are the same problems we've always faced. But really, think about it. Why would FRBR, and for that matter RDA, be anything but business as normal? We are, after all, engaged in the same work we have been for centuries. This new technology just gives us yet another chance to reflect on how we accomplish our librarianship. And thank you for attending. I think we have some time for questions.
This is Jordan. Just a reminder from the beginning, if you have questions for James or Peter, please just type them into the question box.
You know, one thing I can show you guys, and we thought about this with presentation, is what more of the back end of digress.it in WordPress looks like. What do you think? Any thoughts? Think I should do that, Peter?
Sure.
All right, let's see if I can get this to share my desktop view. Are we seeing the desktop?
Yes.
Great. So I don't know if people are familiar with WordPress, but you know, it's this free kind of system that you can, let's make this out of the way, that you can play around with, and you can put data into it. And so what's interesting about the structure is it allows us all to collaborate. We ended up putting the content of FRBR itself in separate posts. And so you can see here we've got like 4.9 attributes of an object, 4.10 attributes of an event, and you know, keeps going through 3 pages of these things. FRBR is a pretty large document. And what you can do is when you create a post, it's kind of helpful, is you can add a new. So let's call this 9.8. The secret section, something extra. Rather than publishing it immediately, you can save a draft. And so this is actually really helpful from a, so now I've saved a draft of this. This is very helpful from a workflow point of view, because part of what you do is not to release the entire FRBR at once, because that's a bit frightening. It's a large document. It's a bit scary. And so you can have a series of drafts like this, and then you can really quick release them every week or so, or every few weeks, or however long you have. You can just go back and hit publish. And so you can have kind of waiting in the wings a series of posts that cover the readings for the section. See, that makes sense.
We do have a few questions now, if you'd like to answer them.
I'm happy to. We're happy to.
The first question is, all of my staff are copy catalogers, and they seem to be most interested in just learning the procedures. The theoretical discussions don't seem to interest them. Do you think the discussion of FRBR is really important to try to do?
So, go ahead, Peter.
No, go ahead.
So I think it's absolutely crucial. And I think it's especially crucial for copy catalogers, because the thing we're dealing with here is this four-letter word. We're dealing with fear, we're dealing with uncertainty, we're dealing with what do these procedures mean, and how as libraries do we continue to do the great work we've always done. Now, a theoretical understanding of FRBR probably isn't necessarily all that useful, especially if someone doesn't care about it. But having the opportunity to work in a group and to kind of identify who the opinion leaders are and who really the experts are locally on this is a very rich opportunity for just the cataloging department to come together and to start thinking about what does it mean to implement FRBR and what does it mean to implement RDA by extension. So I don't know if you have something to add to that, Peter.
No, and I think the other thing I would add, going back to the slide, the screenshot from RDA, if RDA is implemented, and again, maybe this is less important for copy catalogers, but they should still be somewhat familiar, I think, with the tool that they're using, with the standards that we're using. And looking at this table of contents, you have to have at least a basic idea of FRBR to even know where to look for the rules. So.
Well, and I think it's crucial. I think you're right, Peter, because even if you're matching records, you need to have a sense of the underlying structure here. You need to have some of the questions we looked at. Where do these complete works fall? Where do translations fall? And having a sense of what it means. I mean, having memorized FRBR is probably not useful for anyone, but having a sense of how to work your way around it and the kind of questions that it can answer is useful.
And how long was the training?
So, as I said, it took place over 2 monthly meetings, which were about an hour and a half apiece. Excuse me, that was the actual physical activity of connecting the strings to the papers and the books. And then there was the generating buzz and the reading of FRBR leading up to that. So we started that maybe 2 or 3 weeks ahead of time. And again, that was not 2 or 3 weeks of full-time work. That was every couple of days we would publish a new chapter, have people make comments on it, have people discuss it. So that, I think, was not too time-consuming. It was just, and also that let people do the readings whenever they had time. So does that, I hope that answers the question. Anything to add, James?
Yeah, well, Peter said it right. It was 2 in-person meetings and kind of a trickle of comments going through. I think it was probably the most work for us, Peter and I. But again, since we're interested in facilitating conversation, it's a little bit more fun. I could just look at whatever I would happen to be reading that evening and look at the assignments and say, all right, I'm going to make some comments about these based on my own interests. So, yeah, I think aiming for like a month or 2 months, kind of stretching it out, having 2 kind of in-person meetings makes a lot of sense. Do you think it would work better with more, Peter?
I don't think so. I mean, we've talked about it and we haven't had a chance to put it into practice, but doing a similar type of training with FRAD, the authorities section, or the authorities component, and partly we haven't figured out how to do what kind of in-person relations or in-person activity to do with FRAD. So if anyone has any suggestions for that, let us know. But yeah, again, I think especially because now we haven't implemented RDA, we don't have a FRBR catalog, so even though we wanted to bring out the practical and not just the theoretical, it is still somewhat theoretical because we're not putting this into practice yet. So if we implement RDA, maybe we'll look at doing some more of this and doing it for more intensely. But I think for this kind of general introduction to FRBR, definitely the 2 meetings was fine.
Another question. If copy catalogers are not fully trained in FRBR, will they be in danger of choosing the wrong records in OCLC, attaching or failing to attach various manifestations, etc.?
Well, so I think this is an interesting question, and I think it's one that, well, we don't really see too much in the way of FRBRized records in OCLC. Since it is going to become the basis of what we ultimately move to, I think it is a real concern that people need to be aware of this for that very reason. Like, will they attach the wrong record, or will they manage the records incorrectly? But I think this comes back to another point. One of the major purposes of this training was for department managers to begin to try to answer those very questions, right? Because what we really did with strings was simulate a cataloging environment. We worked collaboratively. We had various strings already built. You have things you can see. You have things you can see that you don't quite understand. And seeing how your department worked on these problems, I think is a valuable activity in and of itself, even if it weren't preparing for understanding the foundation for cataloging standards that are surely coming down the pike. And so I guess the answer to that is probably, I'm not sure. I would be concerned if copy catalogers weren't at least conversant with FRBR or able to ask questions of the people in the department who kind of knew the answers. Do you have anything to add to that, Peter?
Yeah, well, I think to paraphrase the question, it sounds like what you're asking is a little bit of knowledge a dangerous thing, and is a little bit of knowledge maybe more dangerous than no knowledge at all? But I think, like James said, I think copy catalogers should have some knowledge of it. In a FRBRized catalog, they would need to have some knowledge. And I think the situation happens now. There's some very complex sections of AACR2 which probably many copy catalogers are not familiar with and don't understand.
Heck,
and might misapply.
There are catalogers, you don't know some of them.
Yes, point taken. So I think that's not necessarily something that's going to go away with RDA and FRBR, or that would be different with RDA and FRBR, because we already have that issue of, there's the whole issue of that we wrestle with daily. Does a new edition require a new record, or can we attach it to the record that has the same copyright date 2 years ago? That's something that, again, in our cataloging department we talk about every day, and we still don't quite have we just have to take it on a case-by-case basis. So I think, and again, just to echo what James has said, that hopefully something like this would open up lines of communication so that the copy catalogers can talk about it amongst themselves and talk about it with the original catalogers and talk about it with their supervisors. Is this a manifestation or an expression? And which record do I attach it to?
We have a couple questions about library staff members that are not in cataloging. How about other library staff, such as acquisition staff, public services staff? Are they also involved in the discussion and the training? And then what kind of buzz did this create amongst other staff members?
We did. This was a discussion James and I had when we were talking about setting this up. And I think I am definitely in favor of opening it up to other staff, maybe not quite, maybe simplify it a little bit. And I think we decided, since it was an experiment, that we really would stick with just the cataloging staff, first of all, just so that we could figure out how to do it. And actually in our institution we do have our acquisitions department performing a lot of our cataloging, a lot of our copy cataloging. So I think, again, with the implementation of RDA, if that happens, this is something we will definitely want to bring them into. And I would also like to open it up to public service staff and faculty, because they're going to be the ones explaining the public catalog to our patrons. So, it would again be helpful for them to have some understanding of how this is working.
Well,
so, go ahead. Sorry, we didn't do it, but I would certainly like to see us do it with a wider staff.
Yeah, and I definitely want to echo that. I mean, FRBR is intended to be a theoretical basis to the work we do in libraries. I mean, it would be like, what if we all didn't have a common understanding of what a book was, meaning the codex? You know, what if we didn't all kind of have a shared knowledge as to what information was? Obviously, certain people need to know FRBR in far more depth than other people, but I think introducing people makes a lot of sense. And in fact, one of the things we discussed, and we might do this in the future, I would be happy to talk to people if we do, was now that we have kind of a department who's relatively familiar with FRBR, and there are a number of people there who kind of know how to read the document, I'm a firm believer in that teaching is one of the best ways to learn something really well. We considered saying, hey, cataloging department, why don't we run a series of workshops for the other departments within the libraries and kind of distribute this knowledge? You know, put little teams together, people who have the time and the energy and the interest to get together with public service, to get together with reference, to get together with special collections, to get together with archives, to get together with collection of, you know, to get together with all these different departments, because in the experience of putting this together, you actually learn to read FRBR much, much more closely. As I'm sure people who've ever taught someone, who've ever tried to teach someone to catalog realize, like, you look at things much more closely.
Have you found that people have begun to use FRBR language in their discussions since you've had the training?
I'd say yes.
Yeah, I think so. And somewhat separate from this discussion, but we have been taking part in the informal RDA testing and have been doing some of our original cataloging in RDA as part of the, we're not an official test site, but, and excuse me, it is of course very helpful to be able to talk about works and expressions when you're dealing with RDA, because you know you need to know where to look up that rule.
Right.
So,
well, and it's extremely quick. I've seen, to echo Peter, it's people use this language in department meetings now, and we play the friendly game of like, oh, did you mean an expression or did you mean a manifestation? You said work. I think you meant a manifestation. And there's kind of a gentle playfulness to it, which
right.
Again was the goal of this. I mean, more than anything, the training's kind of a trick, because the way you really learn something like FRBR is you read it. Right? You sit down, you read it, and you try to understand it. And so the training is an opportunity to make that fun and to create this kind of playful experience with working with cataloging tools, so that there is a reward to kind of exploring these ideas.
One more question. If you have a question that we didn't have time to get to, feel free to type it in the question box now, and we will send out answers to those questions by email later. So final question, we are hearing that RDA doesn't really incorporate FRBR as was supposed to be the case. What is your take on that?
I guess I'm not sure what RDA was supposed to have done and what it is not living up to. I mean, again, the structure of it is certainly based on FRBR.
You guys have the, Peter, you have the RDA toolkit slide up, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So and we've just started working with RDA, so I'm not quite prepared to answer too much about it. But yeah, I would be curious to know what the questioner had in mind specifically that RDA isn't doing that it was promised to do.
Well, and let me try to guess what they're asking, because at least in my, I've just started playing with RDA. Peter is by far the more experienced cataloger of the two of us. But in my working with RDA, knowing the language and being comfortable looking up what things mean is essential. Like, RDA is really big, and it's very kind of hierarchical and has all these places, and you can kind of see it here. If I didn't know what a work and expression were, or a manifestation item were, or I didn't know, what these relationships were, what all the different types were, I wouldn't know where to look in it. So, I mean, as far as reading the text, where the text talks about transcribing something, no, of course, like, you don't need to know FRBR to know how to transcribe something. But as far as finding what rule applies to what you're trying to do, or what rule applies to the material you're looking at, I find it pretty essential. But I'm no official person on RDA's use.
Right. And I guess I would, again, without knowing the basis of the question, would somewhat disagree with the premise, because I found that working with RDA and reading RDA has actually helped kind of, for me, understand some of these different entities. So for example, publication, distribution, production information is in section 1 under manifestations and items. So that has helped me kind of formulate the concept better of what a manifestation is by knowing that publication is an attribute of a manifestation, publication information. So I think I certainly see FRBR and RDA in my limited experience with them, but maybe there is more that it was supposed to do that it didn't. I don't know.
Okay,
that might be a good question. I was just going to say that might be a good question for Bob Maxwell in 2 weeks.
Right, in fact, that's the content of his talk.
Perfect segue. Let's go ahead and if you can share my screen again. And then thanks again, James and Peter, for cheerfully sharing your expertise and advice on implementing FRBR. And thank you to all of our attendees. We hope you found today's session useful. You will soon receive an email with a link to a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to respond to the questions and return the form to us via email. Your comments are very valuable and help the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee plan new offerings. Information about all ALCTS webinars can be found on the ALCTS homepage at www.ala.org/ALCTS. We have 2 more webinars scheduled for this year, and you can see those on the screen. The number of webinars for 2011 is expanding rapidly. We are always interested in suggestions for webinars and other continuing education opportunities. If you have an idea for a webinar, please visit our website where you can submit an online proposal using an online form. Before leaving you today, I would just like to mention that ALCTS will host the Webinar Playground in San Diego during ALA Midwinter. If you plan to attend Midwinter and would like to find out more about the nuts and bolts of developing and presenting a webinar, including some hands-on experience with GoToWebinar, the software that we use, please join us on Sunday, January 9th, 2011, between noon and 2 p.m. Additional details and location information can be found on the ALCTS website. I would also like to thank Wade Wyckoff for providing technical support for today's webinar. The support he and his colleagues on the Continuing Education Committee's Technical Support Subcommittee provide make it possible for us to present these webinars smoothly. Thanks again for joining us this afternoon, and we hope you will participate in other ALCTS Continuing Education offerings again in the future.